Good evening. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for still being here after at least 3 lectures or performances. I'd like to briefly introduce the next performance, which is called No Shortcuts, by 4 performers called Boaz Levin, Alice Escher, Stefan Träger, and Till Wittwer, who are going to give you some instructions of how to deal with the contemporary art market. Thank you.
Good evening. So we are glad to have been invited here at Former West, and we'd like to thank HKW and BAC, as well as Boris Greuß, for making this possible. Tonight we will give a lecture in 10 chapters about repetitive patterns of boom and bust in the financial markets worldwide, and their correlations with the extremely volatile art market. We'll tell a story of an individual who profited from the latest upsurge in the markets and wonders now what will happen to him with the next crisis knocking at his door. And we do all this concluding with a broad and obstreperous, but nonetheless easily feasible suggestion about how to deal with all that and to profit from it, artistically as well as financially. So we start with chapter number 1, Dr. Quoidbach proves a point.
So, good evening. A recent study published in Science magazine describes a psychological phenomena nicknamed by the authors the end of history illusion. It refers to the tendency people have to underestimate how much they will change in the future. During the study, which focuses on personal changes, it was revealed that generally people seem to be much better at recalling their former selves than at imagining how much they would change in the future. As Dr. Quoidbach of Harvard University says, believing that we just reached the peak of our lives or our personal evolution makes us feel good. Dr. McAdams, a psychologist at Northwestern University, has done separate research into the stories people construct about their past and future lives. When he heard about this research, he was reminded of a conversation with his 4-year-old daughter during the height of the craze for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the 1980s. When he told her that one day they might actually not be her favorite thing, she refused to acknowledge the possibility, and yet later, when she was about 20 years old, she confessed to him that part of her 4-year-old mind had realized that he might actually be right. The end of history illusion might help us understand a variety of cultural phenomena. It shades new light on a whole strand of cultural theorists, revealing the 4-year-old logic at work behind Fukuyamists and other defendants of the status quo, but it can also help us understand and come to terms with, and this is what we shall be doing tonight, with the forces behind the so-called success of the art market. So let's take a short detour and look at how this might actually play out within the world of finance and the art market.
Chapter 2. Of the billionaires I have known, money just brings out the basic traits in them. If they were jerks before they had money, they are simply jerks with $1 billion. Or buy on bad news. We are in the mid-70s now, Great Neck, New York, an influential man's youth.
Okay, let's look at some art worth investing in. Okay, we have Edvard Munch, we have Van Gogh, we have de Kooning, we have Jasper Johns, there's some Andy Warhol in here, we have Francis Bacon, and of course, we have Damien Hirst. Do you know what all these works have in common? Well, of course, they probably appear in every school book about fine art. They are expensive, naturally, and they're all owned by one person with an aching back. This guy understands something about money, actually. His parents were a piano teacher and a tailor. Back in high school, it must have been around 1973 or 1974, he developed an interest in poker, which later he claimed has taught him to take calculated risks. Staying with a gamble, he went off to university at the University of Pennsylvania and kept on playing poker at high stakes because he made much more money with it than he would have with a student job. Well, after school, he went off to Wall Street, and on his first day as a broker, he made an $8,000 profit. He was 22 years old. In the meantime, some 30 years have passed, and Wall Street has turned from turtle speed mutual fund action into light speed trading. The hero of our story has made a fortune by being one of the first to discover the advantages of high-speed trading, and he has discovered that the reason for his aching back is a deformed spinal disc. In 2011, Forbes magazine ranks him America's 35th richest man. He owns a hedge fund that carries his name, Stephen A. Cohen Capital Advisors. Well, this hedge fund has a total value of about $14 billion, of which about 40%, that's $5.6 billion, are his private assets. On a good day, SAC Capital is responsible for 3% of all trading that occurs on the New York Stock Exchange. Stephen Cohen framed his success best himself when he stated, "I've been to the top of the mountain and there's not much there." You know, these types of stories don't only appear in history books or glamour magazines. Of course, on Wall Street itself, they tell each other stories. Stories, anyhow, seem to be an important component of what is going on there. You could claim mythology feeds off of numbers. Well, Stephen Cohen became famous on Wall Street when he managed to achieve a breathtaking investment return of 70% in the late 90s dot-com boom. I should mention this maybe a investment return that is considered extraordinary usually is around 30%. Well, that was how he became famous, but he became a legend actually when the next year he changed strategies and bet against the tech business just in the right moment before the tech boom turned into a tech bust. Well, he brought home another 70% and people's jaws dropped. A former competitor states, "It was the Wild West and he was the biggest gunslinger."
Chapter 3. Price is what you pay, value is what you get.
So about the same time, in 1999 to be precise, his vault at home became too small and he started to place his money elsewhere. Namely, he started to build an art collection. And he wasn't just the average old collector, actually he became the collector. So no one spent more money in the business, and within 10 years he had spent an estimated $700 million on art. When he didn't show up at Art Basel, Miami Beach last December, some gallerists went berserk, naturally. That not being enough, in October of 2008, when Sothebys stock was dead cheap, $8.42 as opposed to its all-time high of $57 just a year before, Stephen Cohen obtained vast amounts of the auction house's stock and now owns about 6% of Sothebys. 6% is a percentage large enough to actually make him its third largest stockholder and to have more than just a bit of a saying in Sothebys' proceedings. More recently, though, he has been under intense criminal investigation because his company has been accused of insider trading.
Chapter 4. The art market and its discontents.
So the art market is incredibly volatile. Although at times it seems to perform highly, it has consistently been the case that the higher the climb, the greater the fall. It's one of history's crude jokes that crises should always seem to be so unexpected, and yet, as Dr. Kreutbach pointed out, its narration, signs, and symptoms are so incredibly cliché, repetitive, and generic. But perhaps the best way to show this would be to examine this ongoing narration of boom and bust.
Example 1. The Nikkei crisis.
Well, on December 29th, 1989, the Nikkei 225 hit its all-time closing high of nearly 39,000 points. A year later, by December 28, 1990, the Nikkei was just under 24,000 points. That's a decline of nearly 39%. But 3 years later, grim became quickly quite grimmer. And by then, one could clearly see the ways in which artistic modes of production have been affected or modified by this crisis. An article in the New York Times, which were surveying the art world in the aftermath of the crisis, reads,
"It's impossible to have an excessive decade like the 80s without paying for it later. As the art stars of the past decade fret about having to lower the prices of their work, innumerable young and not so young artists are leaving their studios to teach or illustrate or drive cabs while scrambling for diminishing exhibition space."
Well, desperate times call for desperate measures. And the Times reported on a new artistic trend called Honey, I Shrunk the Art, perhaps the artistic rendering of downsizing. Blue-chip artists such as Frank Stella were witnessed opting for smaller formats, with what was a birth of a newfound appreciation of the miniature. Richard Flood, chief curator of Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, went so far as to call downsizing the anthem of the 90s.
Example 2. Crisis.com.
Well, let's look a little deeper into the art market by examining Sothebys' stock. After it had plummeted during the Nikkei crisis, Sothebys' stock would not peak again for almost another decade, until April 1999. This time it was US millionaires and billionaires, many of whom were made wealthy thanks to the recent internet bubble, who were investing their money in art and driving, consequently, the stock to new heights. As the figure shows, Sotheby's stock price actually peaked 11 months before the S&P 500 and NASDAQ composite indexes did. However, shortly thereafter, by mid-2000, after the burst of the internet bubble, the market was depleted once again. Confidence was swiftly lost, and lofts were emptied. But this crisis was short-lived. It was swept under the carpet, as it were.
Example 3. 7 years of plenty.
Well, the next 7 years were years of plenty and abundance. With the young dot-com billionaires still in the rubble, a new class of ultra-wealthy spawned from the booming hedge fund industry. A risk-loving species, looking for assets to absorb its excess liquidity, used to the thrill of high-frequency trading, and, above all, determined to profit whatever the market tendency may be. Compared to these predators, these bloodthirsty sharks, dot-commers suddenly looked like innocent kids, geeky amateurs sporting their fleece sweatshirts, advertising an e-economy and talking of innovation with a true sense of purpose.
A moral interlude. It's 2006. We are in Las Vegas. Here's a story of a predator and the sudden inflation of monetary value by a surprise coup.
A couple of weekends ago, we went to Las Vegas. We stayed at the Wynn. We like the Wynn, and we like Steve and Elaine Wynn, who own the Wynn. While having breakfast, Steve and Elaine Wynn stopped by our table. Wynn was in a very good mood because, he told us, he had just sold a Picasso for $139 million. The buyer of the painting, Wynn told us, was a man named Stephen Cohen. Everyone seemed to know who Stephen Cohen was, a hedge fund billionaire who lived in Connecticut in a house with a fabulous art collection he had just recently amassed. "This is the most money ever paid for a painting," Steve Wynn said. He invited us to come see the painting before it moved to Connecticut, never to be seen again by anyone but people who knew Stephen Cohen. The next day, we all trooped back to our hotel to see the painting. We went into Wynn's office, past a waiting area with a group of fantastic Warhols, past the secretary's desk with a Matisse over it, and into Wynn's office. There, on the wall, were two large Picassos, one of them, Le Rêve. Steve Wynn launched into a long story about the painting. He told us that it was a painting of Picasso's mistress, Marie-Thérèse Walter, that it was extremely erotic, and that, if you looked at it carefully, you could see that the head of Marie-Thérèse was divided in two sections, and that one of them was a penis. Wynn went on to tell us about the provenance of the painting, who'd first bought it and who'd then bought it. The painting went up for auction in 1997, Wynn was saying. He was standing in front of us, facing us. He raised his hand to show something about the painting, and at that moment, his elbow crashed backwards right through the canvas. There was a terrible noise. Wynn stepped away from the painting, and there, smack, in the middle of Marie-Thérèse Walter's plump and allegedly erotic forearm, was a black hole the size of a silver dollar, or, to be more exact, the size of the tip of Steve Wynn's elbow, with 2 3-inch long ribs coming off it in either direction. Steve Wynn has an eye disease that damages peripheral vision, but he could see quite clearly what had happened. "Oh shit," he said, "look what I've done." The rest of us were speechless. "Thank God it was me," he said. The word money was mentioned by someone, or perhaps it was the word deal. Steve Wynn picked up the phone and left a message for his art dealer. Then he called his wife, Elaine. "You never believe what I just did," he said to her.
Example 4, 7 years of famine.
But the proverbial 7 years of plenty came to an abrupt end, almost as abrupt as $139 million went down the drain. As Scripture hath said, the abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows will be so severe. The most recent crisis proves our point. 2000, as you probably all remember, was a pivotal year. The turning point coincided with Damien Hirst's record-breaking Sothebys auction in London in September. The October auctions, which followed, coinciding with a tumbling stock market, were disastrous, registering record low bought or sold rates, sale rates. Prices plummeted by a record-breaking 43%. The market experienced the most dramatic contraction since '92.
Example 5, the rise of a bipolar art world.
In 2011, the European Art Information Research Center, ArtPrice, reported that China's mainland auction houses brought in a total of nearly $5 billion in sales. This actually shouldn't surprise us. According to the Hurun report, the Chinese variation on Forbes, China has now close to 1 million millionaires and some 115 billionaires, which makes it second only to the US. The gap between the wealthy and the poor is staggering, and with it, as always, comes a thirst for the penultimate luxury commodity, art. Just a couple of weeks ago, Chinese art market monitor Artron released its first ever global report. This was the fruits of a new business alliance with above-mentioned Artprice. According to Thierry Herman, founder and CEO of Artprice, this unique and exclusive alliance with Artron will allow total mastery of an art market that has become bipolar. In other words, West plus Asia.
One of the most public collectors in Beijing is Yang Bin. Mr. Bin, a wealthy car dealer who specializes in American Buicks, Chevrolets, and Cadillacs, started out like many Chinese collectors did, buying his first works in 2000 to decorate his home and office. He is typical of Chinese collectors in that he has bought and sold a considerable amount at auction, often bringing along friends to bid against him. Sometimes he does it for sport, and other times to support an artist he favors. Some of my friends, I push them to buy some, he admits. It is good for them, for investment at least, but above that, maybe it changes their life. But what does all this tell us? Yes, the art market is extremely volatile, but what does it mean? Chapter 6, the art market as overconfidence indicator.
A booming art world has been a consistent sign not of viable financial growth, but of high liquidity, overconfidence, and an imminent bust around the corner. Art prices, and with them the stock prices of art-related companies, tend to grow, peak, and then contract at a rate far more rapid than local GDP growth or common market indexes. A quick survey of the list of the world's most expensive artworks clearly shows numerous chronologically clusters. Logically, these clusters correspond with peaks and relative highs of Sothebys stock. Take a look at these dates again. Each cluster, each peak, is closely knit to an upsurge of liquidity in the market. Surplus capital seeking luxury commodities through which it could be absorbed. In the late 1980s, Japanese art buyers dominated the market for high-end art and were responsible for numerous world record prices. Sotheby's stock price peaked months before the Nikkei began a long decline. The 1999 peak of Sotheby's stock price is associated with the exuberance that telegraphed the tech bust. Although the buyers were different, the dynamics in 2007 were not different. Beneficiaries of easy money, hedge fund executives, among others, bought art at world record prices, driving Sotheby's stock price to new highs. Again, the stock's peak telegraphed the global financial crisis. The most recent peak was driven by Chinese and so-called emerging market buyers, such as Mr. Bin, possibly telegraphing a meltdown in these regions. And just 3 days ago, it was reported that the Chinese art market has contracted by 24%.
Midnight. Stephen A. Cohen lies awake in his bed. What might he be thinking about?
Of course, it is troublesome to be uncertain whether the $700 million you have invested in art are worth the money, especially if you have an $8 million shark rotting away in its formaldehyde tank. And of course, it is just as troublesome to operate a high-speed hedge fund on a basis that is as volatile and fluctuating as ever. The efficiency of the market, they call this. And of course, you might have reason to worry if the federal attorney is breathing hot prosecutor's coffee breath down your neck, trying to load your $14 billion business with an insider trading charge, while you have to convince the stockholders to stay with you. And all of that with this terrible backache. This is all a little bit like sitting blindfolded in a tiny barge which is leaking from a dozen holes, but you have only 10 fingers to plug them while you're being shaken around on a tempestuous ocean. Well, but actually, that's probably not the reason why Stephen Cohen has a hard time falling asleep.
Chapter 7. Buy on the rumor, sell on the news. We are now inside Stephen A. Cohen's head.
What Stephen A. Cohen is probably worried most about is losing his edge.
Edge. A1. Incisive or penetrating quality.
Writing with a satirical edge.
2. A noticeable harsh or sharp quality.
Her voice had an edge to it.
3. A secondary but distinct quality.
Rock music with a bluesy edge.
B. Keenness or intensity of desire or enjoyment.
Lost my competitive edge.
C. A favorable margin, an advantage.
Has an edge on the competition.
Well, if you have edge on your side, you can make things happen. Yeah, you can make reality. You don't have to wait for reality to make you. Mark T. Hebner, the CEO of the financial consulting corporation Index Fund Advisors, writes, "Most people are beaten up by the market instead of beating the market." Well, edgy you is precisely not most people. Let's think of edge as being basically the same thing that could be called the muse in a different arena. So artists need to have an edge as well if they want to be successful. And this necessity to obtain and somehow cage the edge is precisely something that Stephen Cohen shares with all the artists he collects. The works on display on the walls and hallways of his mansion were produced by artists at the peak of their careers. They had edge on their side, and I could well imagine Stephen Cohen, sleepless from all the worries and the backache haunting him, taking a nightly stroll down the halls of his private collection. So he walks down the halls in an attempt to actually exploit these totem qualities of the works and to soak up their radiating energy, precisely their edge. He slowly walks past the Munchs and the Van Goghs and the de Koonings and the Warhols and the Jasper Johns and the Bacons until he reaches the tank with a rotting fish. And there it comes back, vanitas, the fear of falling into the black square. Kazimir Malevich tells the story about his friend's health problems. You know, they were great artists, he says, but their health was in terrible condition. So, hoping to get better, they moved out to the countryside and left the city and its daily businesses behind. And indeed, it worked. Their health improved remarkably, but at the same time, their art got remarkably worse. So, Malevich concludes, in order to be successful or a good artist, you have to foster the bacillus. Probably Stephen Cohen fosters his aching back. As long as he is hurting, he believes, he can maintain his edge. But after all, this is just speculation.
Chapter 8. The first rule is never to lose money. The second rule is never to forget about rule number 1. Or, should you find yourself in a chronically leaking boat, energy devoted to changing vessels is likely to be more productive than energy devoted to patching leaks. Now, a steep mountain slope, the valley inside.
Actually, very recently, Stephen Cohen has signaled that the trading business has worn him out. In one of his extremely rare interviews, he states, "There's a lot of other things I can do. I don't have to sit at the desk. Seriously, I have nothing left to prove. I've been doing this for 33 years. My dream is to liberate myself. So, is that a midlife crisis, or is it just being fucking smart? I don't know, but it's exciting." Do you remember the beginning of our lecture when we quoted Dr. Quoidbach from Harvard University? I wonder if Stephen Cohen still feels good about himself, since it seems to get increasingly hard for him to believe that he is on the peak of his personal evolution. It rather seems that now that he has been to the top of the lonesome mountain, he has started a steep decline.
Chapter 9. In every crisis lies the seed of opportunity, or judo and the market. It's a vicious cycle, especially for us artists. We are the first to suffer and the last to profit. The market asserts its presence ever so violently within our lives and practices, and yet we have little or no say as to its form and function. But what if we could avert the risk of a slumping market? Or better yet, just like in judo, using its own force against it. The market does offer one such tool, an infamous financial instrument used by Cohen and his likes, one of the dirtiest tricks up a hedge funder's cuff.
Shorting.
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 Shorting! So, shorting for artists, because a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So, we'll teach you how not to waste it. But what is shorting? So, in a nutshell, shorting or selling short basically means betting against the market or against the value of a specific commodity. It means using the market's own force against it. So, normally when investing in stock, one buys a specific product hoping it will rise in value. So if the value rises and the stock is sold, a profit is made. But if the value drops and the stock is sold, money is lost. But wait a second. Let's combine these two sentences. If the value drops and the stock is sold, a profit is made. This is the basic mechanism behind shorting. So when shorting, one profits from the decrease in value of a stock. But how does it work? First, you just borrow a stock from a broker. Then you just sell the stock you borrowed. If the price of the stock falls now, let's say a day later, you buy the same amount of shares back for less money. This would be a winning scenario, because then you just return the loan to your broker and you score a profit. If the price of the stock happens to rise, one is forced to return the loan at a loss. In other words, a successful short depends on the ability to predict or to speculate on a fall in value.
You can't have a shorting position in an artwork or an artist, but what you can do is short an art-related and publicly traded company, such as Sothebys or ArtNet.
So the company we will short is Sothebys. Why go for this company first? Well, as we have seen, Sothebys stock is extremely volatile and thus vulnerable, as well as an indicator of market overconfidence in general, and also an indicator for crisis in the art market. Sotheby is a pivotal figure in the art market's ups and downs, and when its stock's price drops, it will affect the whole market.
So our plan is now to engage in an act of crowd shorting. Actually, it's quite similar to crowdfunding.
Now, there are two ways to help us collect the funds needed. We put together a website which spells out all the details and explains our efforts. The first site that you find on the first possibility that you find on the website is a classic way of support in the arts economy, and that is donations. A way to conspicuously support our efforts is to go to our web store and purchase one of our shorting products. The gains from the shorting, all the money collected, of course, will be pooled, and as soon as we have enough funds, we will short. The gains from the shorting will be invested in further shorting efforts. So Sotheby's stock moves around the price of $39 at the moment. In order to be able to short, you have to buy one lot. One lot is 100 shares, or a number that is divisible by 100. So in order to be able to short, we have to buy 100 shares. That means we need about $3,900, or roughly 3,000 euros, to be able to do what we want to do. If blah, 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 of course, the more money we can collect, the better.
Well, that's not too much money, you say. Why can't we just do it ourselves?
That's true, of course. That could work. You could do it. Nonetheless, we would like to function as your broker. We'd like to pool the money and collect smaller or occasionally larger portions from many sources in a collective effort, since we feel that shorting Sothebys is more than just financial speculation. As we mentioned before, we think of it as a hedging strategy for anyone who is interested, and actually of a signal from within the art world appropriating financial tools and hijacking them. Let your broker work for you.
We have before us a 5-year plan.
Stage 1, the launch.
Raising the minimum funds needed for an initial shorting position in Sothebys through sales of merchandise and donations.
Stage 2, expansion.
Reinvesting profits and expanding our shorting portfolio. After signing up, you, as donors and buyers, will receive dividends on a regular basis. We will offer different investment accounts designed for a variety of asset classes and participation levels.
Stage 3, the aesthetization of finance.
Achieving the goal of an aesthetization of finance.
Chapter 10, the conclusion.
Well, as Anton Vidokle wrote in an article which was published in eFlux just a couple of days ago, we must find the terms for articulating what kind of economy artists really want. Well, ours is an attempt at exactly such an articulation. Instead of shying away from art's so-called financialization, from the artistic portfolio becoming a transmutation of the stock portfolio, we embrace it, while also offering as a type of counterbalance an aesthetization of finance. Instead of breaking out of this vicious cycle which we described, we want to harness its own powers against it. So our vision stands midway between an avant-garde to come, an avant-garde dream of rupture, an endgame strategy aimed at nullifying the current balance of power, and a scheme for risk management. Just a bunch of artists hedging our bets. Our idea is basically to short art, and to do this both as a hedging strategy and as a form of artistic speculation, a career decision working towards a financial avant-garde. Well, if we succeed, and the art market indeed does go downhill, we'll be rich. If we fail, and everything stays the same, well, everything stays the same. But instead of leaving the financial value of art to be determined by a secondary market devoid of artists, instead of letting a chain of middlemen peddle prices, hoard artworks, and fix sales, why not reiterate artistic agency and inscribe it within exactly this market? Thank you very much, and have a nice conference.